Greetings, seekers of truth and spiritual understanding. What if I told you that everything you've been led to believe about suffering is based on a fundamental misunderstanding? A misunderstanding so profound that it has shaped the entire course of human history and your own personal journey. The ancient texts, those repositories of wisdom that have survived millennia of suppression and distortion, reveal a startling truth. You were never meant to suffer. Look around you. The world seems designed to amplify suffering at every turn. Financial struggles, relationship pain, physical ailments, emotional trauma, these experiences feel woven into the very fabric of human existence. But what if this illusion of inevitable suffering is the greatest deception ever perpetrated on human consciousness? Deep within the most sacred texts across civilizations, from the Nag Hammadi library to the Upanishads, from hidden Taoist manuscripts to esoteric Kabbalistic teachings, lies a consistent revelation that has been deliberately obscured from mainstream understanding. These texts, written by those who achieved the highest states of consciousness, unanimously point to a profound truth. Suffering is not your natural state. It is not the divine plan for your existence. It is not an inevitable aspect of being human. You feel it, don't you? That persistent inner knowing that something isn't right about the way life unfolds. That nagging sensation that there must be another way to experience this reality. This isn't just wishful thinking. It's your soul's recognition of a truth that has been hidden from you. What would change in your life right now if you discovered that the suffering you've experienced, perhaps for decades, was never meant to be part of your journey? How would your perception shift if you realized that the ancient masters weren't speaking in metaphors or distant utopian ideals, but were revealing practical truths about your very nature? The mystery schools of Egypt, the hidden teachings of early Christian mystics, the carefully guarded secrets of the Essenes, all contained methodologies for transcending suffering that were intentionally removed from public teachings. Why? Because a population that discovers its inherent freedom from suffering becomes ungovernable by systems that rely on fear and limitation. Today, we'll journey into these ancient revelations, deconstructing the architecture of suffering that has been unnecessarily imposed upon your consciousness. You'll discover why these teachings were systematically removed from mainstream spiritual traditions, and more importantly, how to reclaim the natural state of being that has been your birthright all along. If you're resonating with these truths already, take a moment to support this channel's mission of awakening consciousness. Subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you never miss these crucial revelations. By liking and sharing this video, you become part of a collective force, reintroducing these essential truths to humanity at a time when they're desperately needed. Together, we're rebuilding the bridge to wisdom that was deliberately destroyed centuries ago. The foundations of suffering weren't embedded in your consciousness by accident. They were systematically constructed through a deliberate misinterpretation of our most sacred texts. Let me take you back to what the ancients actually knew, not what you've been told they knew. The Sanskrit concept of Sat Chit Ananda appears consistently in the Upanishads, describing your fundamental nature as truth consciousness bliss, not truth consciousness suffering, not truth consciousness struggle. The Vedic sages weren't describing some distant ideal or post-death reward. They were documenting the fundamental basis of human consciousness before it became distorted through misunderstanding. Similarly, when we examine the original Aramaic texts that preceded biblical translations, we find that Jesus' teachings on suffering were profoundly mistranslated. The concept of carrying your cross was never about embracing suffering as virtuous. The Aramaic root words actually point to embracing your divine assignment or sacred purpose. The glorification of suffering was a later construct, inserted to make populations more accepting of unnecessary hardship. What most people don't understand is that these mistranslations weren't innocent scholarly errors. They represented a deliberate recoding of spiritual wisdom to engineer a consciousness that accepts suffering as inevitable, even necessary. The architects of these distortions understood that a person who believes they're destined to suffer will never access their true creative power. Imagine you're walking through a magnificent forest. The sun filters through the canopy, birds sing in harmonious patterns, and the ground beneath your feet feels supportive and alive. Now imagine you've been told since birth that forests are places of inevitable danger and suffering, that thorns cutting your skin and fear clutching your heart is simply the forest experience. You'd move through that same environment in a completely different way, wouldn't you? You'd tense your muscles, restrict your breathing, narrow your vision to scan for threats. The forest hasn't changed, but your experience of it has been fundamentally altered by a false narrative. This is precisely what happened to humanity's experience of existence itself. The pure awareness that is your birthright, naturally peaceful, expansive, and filled with creative potential, became contracted around a core belief in inevitable suffering. This contraction isn't your natural state, it's a learned response to a false teaching. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, many sections were quickly hidden from public view. Why? Because they contained direct teachings about the artificial nature of suffering. These texts explicitly stated that what we call suffering is actually a misperception, a kind of cognitive illusion that can be dissolved through specific awareness practices. These teachings were deemed too destabilizing for public consumption because they undermined centuries of conditioning. Once you recognize that suffering was encoded into spiritual teachings as a control mechanism, you begin the process of liberating yourself from its grip. You start questioning every instance where you've been told that pain is necessary for growth, that struggle is the only path to achievement, that sacrifice is the prerequisite for love. These are not cosmic truths. They are programmed limitations with identifiable historical origins. If you're finding these revelations challenging or eye-opening, share your thoughts in the comments below. When did you first suspect that suffering might not be the natural state of human existence? Your experience is a vital piece of this collective awakening, and your voice matters in this conversation. What if I told you that suffering isn't just a philosophical concept, but an actual energetic mechanism that can be observed, understood, and ultimately transcended? The ancient Hermetic texts, particularly those attributed to Thoth in Egypt and later compiled in the Corpus Hermeticum, describe what they called the architecture of limitation, a detailed explanation of how suffering is generated within human consciousness. These teachings were considered so powerful that they were hidden in plain sight, encoded in symbols and metaphors that only initiates could interpret. Today, we're going to decode this hidden knowledge. At the core of these teachings is a revolutionary understanding. Suffering is not an event that happens to you, but a process that happens through you. It is an alchemical reaction requiring 3 specific elements to manifest. And if any one of these elements is removed, suffering cannot sustain itself. The first element is identification. When consciousness becomes completely identified with a temporary form or experience, it forgets its own nature as the witnessing awareness. The ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic texts describe this as the soul forgetting its wings. The second element is resistance, the energetic contraction against what is appearing in your experience. And the third is time-bound consciousness, the projection of identity into past and future rather than the eternal now where your true nature resides. The mystics of the Essene tradition understood this mechanism so clearly that they developed specific practices to interrupt this process at each stage. These practices weren't abstract meditations. They were precise interventions in the machinery of suffering. But these teachings virtually disappeared from Western spiritual traditions by the 4th century, deliberately removed because they gave too much sovereignty to the individual. Consider the nature of water for a moment. In its natural state, water flows freely, adapting to every container while remaining essentially unchanged in its nature. It can appear as a raging river or a placid lake, as destructive flood or nurturing rain, but its essence remains unaltered. Now imagine if water could forget its fluid nature and believe it was only the particular form it had temporarily assumed. It would experience the inevitable change of that form as a kind of death or suffering. This is precisely what happens within human consciousness. Your awareness, infinitely adaptable, inherently peaceful, temporarily identifies with forms and experiences that are constantly changing. The suffering doesn't come from the change itself, but from the forgetting of your fluid nature. The ancient Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation describes this forgetting as the cosmic error, not a sin or a moral failing, but simply a misperception that can be corrected through proper understanding. The text contains precise instructions for recognizing awareness itself rather than becoming hypnotized by its contents. When practiced, these instructions don't just temporarily relieve suffering, they reveal its fundamental impossibility within true nature. What's most fascinating about these ancient teachings is how they align with the most cutting-edge understandings in neuroscience and consciousness studies. Modern research into neuroplasticity confirms that the brain architecture supporting the suffering mechanism can be systematically rewired. The default mode network, the brain system responsible for the sense of separate self that can suffer, can be temporarily deactivated, revealing a baseline consciousness that lacks the very structure necessary for suffering to occur. This isn't about denying pain or pretending that challenging circumstances don't exist. It's about recognizing that the transformation of pain into suffering is not mandatory. It's an optional process that the ancient texts meticulously mapped out how to opt out of. If you're finding value in these forgotten teachings, help ensure they reach those who need them most. Subscribe to this channel now, activate notifications, and share this video with at least one person you feel would benefit from this ancient knowledge. Together, we're reconstructing wisdom that has been systematically dismantled over centuries. The ancient texts didn't just diagnose the illness of suffering, they prescribed specific remedies that have been systematically removed from mainstream spiritual teachings. These weren't vague suggestions to think positive or accept what is. They were precise protocols for rewiring consciousness itself, developed and refined over thousands of years of direct experimentation with awareness. What you're about to discover has been hidden in esoteric branches of every major tradition, from Gnostic Christianity to Dzogchen Buddhism, from Advaita Vedanta to Sufi mysticism. These traditions preserved techniques that were deemed too powerful for the general population because they undermined the very foundation of control systems, the belief in inevitable suffering. The first practice comes from the mystery schools of Egypt and relates to what they called the solar body. Ancient hieroglyphic instructions detail a specific form of attention training where consciousness learns to recognize itself rather than becoming lost in its objects. The initiates were taught to become as Ra, to identify with the observing awareness rather than the contents being observed. This wasn't metaphorical, it was a direct pointing to the experiential fact that awareness itself never suffers. Only the temporary identifications within awareness seem to suffer. In practical terms, this looks like a moment-by-moment recognition of what in Zen is called the witness, the unchanging consciousness that experiences all changing phenomena. When you fully embody this recognition, suffering becomes impossible because what suffers, the temporary self-concept, is revealed as just another appearance within what you truly are. Here's what makes this revolutionary. This isn't about removing pain from life. It's about removing the mandatory conversion of pain into suffering. Pain may still arise. The ancient masters weren't promising a life without sensation or challenge. They were revealing something far more profound. that you can experience everything without the additional layer of suffering that comes from misidentification. The Essene manuscripts describe a daily practice they called returning to the source. Dodi, this involved systematically tracing every experience of suffering back to its root, not in external circumstances, but in the consciousness that was perceiving those circumstances. Through this practice, initiates discovered that suffering wasn't happening to them. It was happening through a particular configuration of attention that could be reconfigured. Imagine you're watching a movie that makes you feel intense fear. Your heart races, your muscles tense, your breathing becomes shallow. These responses are real physiological events. But what happens when you suddenly remember this is just a movie? The physical sensations might continue briefly, but the suffering, the additional layer of distress about the distress, dissolves instantly. This is what the ancient practices facilitated. Not an escape from life's movie, but a recognition of your true position in relation to it. The Upanishads contain detailed instructions for a practice called neti neti, not this, where the practitioner systematically investigates every aspect of experience that could possibly suffer, only to discover that their true nature is what remains when all these temporary identifications are seen through. This wasn't a philosophical exercise. It was a direct experiential inquiry that reliably revealed the impossibility of suffering within pure awareness. What's remarkable about these various techniques across traditions is their consistency. Whether expressed in the language of Sufism or Taoism, Gnosticism or Advaita, they all point to the same experiential discovery. Suffering requires misidentification, and this misidentification is optional once recognized. These practices weren't removed from mainstream teaching because they didn't work. They were removed precisely because they worked too well. A person who discovers the optional nature of suffering becomes incredibly difficult to control through the usual mechanisms of fear, desire, and social conditioning. What would your life look like if you applied these ancient technologies of consciousness? How would your relationship to challenge and difficulty transform if you could experience everything without the additional layer of suffering? This isn't about bypassing or denying the full range of human experience. It's about engaging with that experience from your true nature rather than a case of mistaken identity. If you're finding these ancient practices illuminating, take a moment to leave a comment sharing which tradition or approach resonates most strongly with you. Are you drawn to the Egyptian solar consciousness, the Essene source tracing, or the Vedantic self-inquiry? Your reflection helps build a community of practice around these rediscovered teachings. The ancient alchemical texts weren't primarily about turning lead into gold. That was merely the outer symbolism for a profound inner transformation. What these texts actually detailed was the precise methodology for transmuting the lead of suffering into the gold of liberated consciousness. This knowledge was so carefully guarded that it was encoded in deliberately confusing symbolism, accessible only to those who had been properly initiated. The Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, contains the famous phrase, "As above, so below." But the complete teaching continues, "As within, so without. As the universe, so the soul." This isn't just poetic language, it's a precise instruction about the fractal nature of consciousness and suffering. It reveals that the patterns creating suffering in your personal experience are identical to those operating at the cosmic level, and therefore, personal liberation affects the entire field of consciousness. What most people don't understand about these alchemical teachings is that they weren't metaphorical or merely psychological. They described actual energetic transmutations that occur when consciousness recognizes its own nature. The philosopher's stone, sought by alchemists, wasn't an external substance, but an internal recognition, the direct realization that awareness itself is already the gold being sought, and everything appearing within it is simply awareness taking temporary form. Consider for a moment how water becomes steam. The essential nature doesn't change. It's still H2O, but its expression and capabilities transform dramatically. Similarly, these ancient practices don't add anything to your consciousness. They simply change its state, revealing potentials that were always present but unexpressed. In the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is quoted saying, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." Indeed, this isn't about external salvation, but about the alchemical process of allowing your true nature to emerge from beneath the accretions of false identity that generate suffering. The practical application of this alchemical knowledge involves a process the Taoist texts called reversal. Instead of consciousness flowing outward and becoming identified with objects, it reverses direction and recognizes itself as the source of all experience. This isn't a withdrawal from life, but a radical re-entering of life from a different dimension of being, from the dimension that cannot suffer because it is the unchanging context in which all change occurs. Imagine you've spent your entire life believing you were a character in a dream, experiencing all the limitations and sufferings of that character. Then suddenly you realize you're actually the dreamer. Nothing in the dream content has changed, but your relationship to all of it transforms instantly. You can still engage with the dream, perhaps even more fully than before, but the suffering that came from exclusive identification with the character has been dissolved. This is why the ancient texts consistently describe enlightenment not as achieving something new, but as recognizing what has always been the case. The Sanskrit term Maya doesn't mean that the world is an illusion in the sense of not existing. It means that we perceive it through a filter of misunderstanding that generates unnecessary suffering. When that filter is removed, the world doesn't disappear. It's revealed as a perfect expression of the very awareness that perceives it. The Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation contains specific practices for what it calls self-liberation of phenomena, where each experience that would normally trigger suffering is instead recognized as empty of inherent existence, meaning it has no fixed, separate nature apart from the awareness in which it appears. When this recognition is lived, rather than merely understood intellectually, suffering becomes impossible because its fundamental premise has been undercut. What's most revolutionary about these alchemical teachings is that they don't require decades of arduous practice or special circumstances. They point to a recognition that can occur in any moment, regardless of external conditions. The Zen tradition expresses this in the direct pointing. This very body is the Buddha. This very earth is the lotus paradise. The shift from suffering to liberation isn't a distant achievement, but an immediate possibility through direct recognition of what's already the case. If this alchemical understanding resonates with something deep within you, become part of spreading this ancient wisdom in our modern world. Subscribe to this channel now and activate notifications so you never miss these essential teachings. Like and share this video to help others discover the transformative power of these long-suppressed truths. Together, we're participating in a collective alchemical process, transforming the consciousness of humanity one recognition at a time. The ancient texts across traditions weren't conveying separate, disconnected teachings about suffering. They were approaching the same fundamental truth from different angles, like various witnesses describing the same mountain from different vantage points. When we integrate these perspectives, a cohesive and revolutionary understanding emerges. Suffering is not woven into the fabric of existence, but is generated through a specific mechanism of consciousness that can be transcended. The Vedantic concept of Sat Chit Ananda, being consciousness bliss, the Hermetic understanding of consciousness as the primary substance of reality, the Gnostic recognition of false identification as the root of suffering, and the alchemical technologies for transmuting consciousness. These aren't separate teachings, but facets of a unified reality that has been deliberately fragmented in our understanding. This fragmentation wasn't accidental. The complete picture would reveal that the structures generating suffering, both individually and collectively, are not cosmic necessities, but constructs that can be dismantled. This recognition is profoundly liberating for the individual, but potentially destabilizing for systems built on the premise that suffering is inevitable. Consider how different human civilization might have developed if this understanding had remained at its center. How would our economic systems function if they weren't predicated on the fear of scarcity and suffering? How would our relationships unfold if they weren't shadowed by the belief that loss and pain are the inevitable price of love? How would we approach the development of human potential if we didn't believe that struggle and suffering were necessary components of growth? These aren't merely philosophical questions. They point to practical possibilities for reconstructing both individual consciousness and collective systems based on the truth revealed in these ancient texts, that your fundamental nature is already complete, already free, already beyond the reach of suffering. The ancient masters weren't describing distant utopian ideals or post-death rewards. They were pointing to what is already the case beneath the layers of misunderstanding. The Buddha's direct statement, "I teach only suffering and the end of suffering," wasn't proposing a new belief system. It was pointing to the experiential discovery that suffering is optional once its mechanism is understood. You've likely had glimpses of this truth throughout your life, moments when the sense of separate self temporarily dissolved, and with it, all possibility of suffering. Perhaps it happened in nature, in meditation, in creative flow, in love, or even in the midst of intense challenge. These weren't anomalies or temporary escapes from reality. They were momentary recognitions of reality without the overlay of misidentification. What the ancient texts provide is not just inspiration, but specific technologies for stabilizing this recognition, for making it the foundation of your life rather than an occasional visitor. These technologies don't require you to withdraw from life or adopt exotic beliefs. They simply invite you to investigate your direct experience with precision and honesty, to question the assumptions that suffering requires, and to discover what remains when those assumptions are seen through. This is not a journey of attainment, but of recognition. You aren't working towards some future state of liberation. You're clearing away the misunderstandings that obscure the liberation that is already your nature. This is why the Chan Buddhist tradition states, if you want to be free of the suffering of the six realms, you must learn to see through the illusion of I, not transcend the I, not improve the I, not purify the I, but see through the illusion that it was ever anything other than a temporary construct within boundless awareness. The implications of this understanding in your life are immediate and profound. Every experience of suffering becomes an opportunity for recognition rather than an obstacle to happiness. Every challenging circumstance becomes a doorway to deeper understanding rather than evidence of cosmic injustice or personal inadequacy. Every relationship becomes a unique expression of the one consciousness recognizing itself through different forms. This isn't spiritual bypass or toxic positivity. It's the direct recognition that suffering is generated not by life circumstances, but by a particular way of perceiving those circumstances, a way that is optional rather than mandatory once it's clearly seen. The time for this recognition is now. Not because suffering has reached some unprecedented level in our world, but because the collective consciousness is ready for this ancient understanding to be restored to its rightful place at the center of human awareness. The fragmentation of this teaching across traditions, the deliberate obscuring of its most essential aspects, the replacement of direct recognition with complex belief systems, these distortions are being undone as individuals like you reclaim this birthright of understanding. If these ancient revelations have awakened something within you, become an active participant in this collective remembering. Subscribe to this channel now to join a community dedicated to rediscovering and implementing these timeless truths. Share this video with others who are ready for this understanding. Your engagement isn't just supporting content creation, it's helping to reconstruct a foundation of wisdom that has been systematically dismantled over centuries. The ancient texts are unanimous. You were never meant to suffer. This truth isn't a philosophical position to be debated, but a direct reality to be experienced. And that experience is available now, in this very moment, through the simple but revolutionary recognition of what you already are. Watch the video appearing on screen now to continue this journey of discovery. Remember, the liberation described in these ancient texts isn't a distant goal. It's the recognition of your most immediate nature, available in this and every moment.